In America, houses this big are not supposed to survive. They are meant to be torn down, sold off, or forgotten once the money runs out. And yet, hidden in the mountains of North Carolina, there is a house with 250 rooms, 4 acres under one roof, and a history that should have ended decades ago. Every other mansion from its era collapsed under its own weight. This one did not. Why? Why did the largest private home ever built in the United States escape demolition, bankruptcy, and abandonment? Why is it still owned by the same family more than a century later, when even the richest dynasties lost everything? And what choices were made behind closed doors to keep it standing when logic said it should disappear? This is not a documentary about luxury. It is a documentary about survival, about a house that refused to die, and the people who quietly broke every rule of the Gilded Age to save it. Stay with this. Because once you understand how Biltmore survived, you'll never look at wealth, legacy, or success the same way again. It is Christmas Eve, 1895. Snow settles quietly across the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Carriages roll through iron gates toward a sight no one in America has ever seen before. A house rises from the mountainside, massive and improbable, finished at last after 6 years of uninterrupted labor. Calling it a house barely captures what stands there. Biltmore contains 250 rooms. At a time when the White House holds just over half that number, this private residence stretches across nearly 180,000 square feet. More than 4 acres exist beneath a single roof. There are 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces, because a single hearth could never be enough. 3 full kitchens prepare meals for dozens at a time. An indoor swimming pool holds 70,000 gallons of heated water. A bowling alley, a gymnasium, and a library capable of housing 10,000 volumes sit within its walls. This is 1895, an era when most Americans still rely on outhouses and wash basins. What makes Biltmore even more extraordinary is not only its scale, but its location. It is not in New York City, surrounded by other symbols of industrial wealth. It is not in Newport, Rhode Island, where Gilded Age families competed to outbuild one another with summer palaces. It stands instead in the mountains of western North Carolina, hours from any major city, surrounded by land that had been stripped, logged, and exhausted. The construction required more than 1,000 workers and skills that did not yet exist in America. Stonemasons were brought from Italy, France, and England. An entire railway line had to be built simply to transport materials. Indiana limestone was shipped hundreds of miles. Marble came from Italy, oak from England, tile from Spain. The cost reached $6 million in 1895, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today, enough to fund towns, universities, or industries. One man spent it on a home. That man was George Washington Vanderbilt II. Born into one of the wealthiest families in American history, George stood apart from his relatives in nearly every way. While his brothers expanded railroads and accumulated power, George retreated into books. He was shy, deeply private, and intensely intellectual. By his 20s, he spoke multiple languages fluently and had lived for long periods in Europe, studying art, architecture, history, agriculture, and forestry. His personal library would eventually exceed 23,000 volumes, not purchased for display, but read, annotated, and absorbed. In an age obsessed with conquest and profit, George Vanderbilt pursued understanding. During years of travel through France, England, Germany, and Italy, George walked the great estates of Europe. He studied how architecture related to landscape, how land could be productive and beautiful at the same time, how culture could be cultivated deliberately. Slowly, a vision formed. He would create an American estate that rivaled Europe's greatest, not as a copy, but as something new. A home for art, books, and learning. A self-sustaining landscape demonstrating modern forestry and agriculture. A place built to last. In 1888, George visited Asheville, North Carolina. The air was clean, the mountains ancient, and the land surrounding the town lay depleted and abandoned. Where others saw ruin, George saw potential. Over several years, he quietly assembled more than 125,000 acres, paying local farmers fairly and earning a reputation unlike that of other industrial heirs. He hired a young forester named Gifford Pinchot to restore the land using scientific principles never before applied on such a scale in America. Forests would be replanted, streams restored, the land itself would become productive again. At the heart of this vast estate, George commissioned architect Richard Morris Hunt to design a French Renaissance chateau inspired by the great houses of the Loire Valley. Construction began in 1889. While the exterior echoed medieval Europe, the interior was among the most technologically advanced homes in the world. Electricity powered by private generators. Central heating, elevators, fire alarms, mechanical refrigeration, an intercom system connecting servants throughout the house. Biltmore was old-world beauty fused with modern innovation. When the doors opened on Christmas Eve, 1895, guests entered a space that defied expectation. The winter garden greeted them first, filled with light, palms, and fountains beneath a glass ceiling. The banquet hall soared 70 feet high, its tapestries centuries old, its massive fireplace large enough to stand within. The library held thousands of carefully chosen books. Every room was distinct, crafted not to intimidate, but to invite. Biltmore was meant to be lived in, yet the house could not function without people. Nearly 80 servants lived and worked on the estate, forming a hidden world behind the grandeur. Housemaids, footmen, chefs, gardeners, grooms, and foresters worked from before dawn until nightfall. Fires were lit before the family woke, meals prepared in courses numbering into the dozens. Laundry washed by hand in endless cycles. Servants moved through hidden staircases, remaining unseen by design. George treated his staff well by the standards of the time, but the work was relentless. Maintaining Biltmore required constant effort and enormous expense, a reality that would one day threaten its survival. Despite his shy nature, George filled Biltmore with guests. Writers, artists, politicians, and intellectuals gathered there. Edith Wharton walked its halls. Henry James reflected on its irony. Alice Roosevelt swam in its pool and marveled at its audacity. John Singer Sargent painted within its rooms. Hunting parties roamed the surrounding forests. Christmas celebrations became legendary. Biltmore was not simply a house, but a cultural center, alive with conversation and ideas. Still, something was missing. George was nearing 40, unmarried, living alone in a palace built for family life. Then, in Paris in 1898, he met Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. Confident, experienced, and socially adept, she complemented George perfectly. Their marriage was quiet and private, but transformative. Edith brought discipline, management, and warmth to Biltmore. She recognized the estate's financial vulnerabilities and began correcting them. When their daughter Cornelia was born in 1900, Biltmore became what George had always intended, a family home. George's happiness was brief. In 1914, he died unexpectedly at 51. Edith was left with a teenage daughter, a vast estate operating at a loss, and a world on the brink of war. The Gilded Age was ending. Taxes rose, social attitudes shifted. Other great estates were abandoned, sold, or demolished. Edith refused to let Biltmore follow them. She reduced costs, modernized operations, and made decisions that shocked society. In 1930, she opened Biltmore to paying visitors. During the Great Depression, ordinary Americans walked through rooms once reserved for the elite. The income saved the estate. Edith sold most of the surrounding land to create Pisgah National Forest, preserving George's forestry legacy while securing financial stability. During World War II, priceless artwork from Washington was stored safely within Biltmore's walls. When Edith died in 1958 at 92, she had preserved what seemed impossible to preserve. In the decades that followed, Biltmore adapted again. Tourism expanded. A winery was established. Hotels, events, and experiences diversified its income. The estate remained in family hands, maintained not as a museum frozen in time, but as a living place. Today, more than 1 million visitors pass through its doors each year. Biltmore survives because each generation chose adaptation over abandonment. It stands not only as a monument to wealth, but to vision, stewardship, and persistence. Against every precedent, America's greatest mansion endures, still rising from the North Carolina mountains, still inspiring those who walk its halls, proof that even the most improbable dreams can survive when someone is willing to fight for them. Biltmore's survival is not an accident. It is the result of continuous decision-making under pressure. Each generation forced to confront the same question in a different era. How do you preserve something that was never meant to exist in the modern world? By the mid-20th century, the estate no longer resembled the self-contained universe George Vanderbilt had envisioned. The age of vast domestic staffs had vanished. The servant hierarchy that once powered the house was gone, replaced by salaried employees, preservation specialists, and maintenance crews operating under modern labor laws. What had once been a private household now functioned more like a small corporation, balancing heritage with economics. Yet even as Biltmore evolved into a business, its core identity remained intact. The house was never stripped or modernized beyond recognition. No priceless rooms were gutted for convenience. The library stayed a library. The banquet hall remained a banquet hall. The winter garden continued to bloom. Preservation, not reinvention, guided every major decision. This restraint is what separates Biltmore from so many other Gilded Age survivors. Where others were hollowed out or repurposed beyond recognition, Biltmore adapted without surrendering its soul. Climate control systems were hidden behind walls. Fire suppression systems were installed without disturbing historic finishes. Modern infrastructure was added carefully, invisibly, so that the illusion of stepping into 1895 was preserved. The surrounding landscape followed the same philosophy. The remaining 8,000 acres are still actively managed, not frozen wilderness, but working land. Forests are harvested sustainably. Trails are maintained. Gardens are replanted season after season. The estate remains alive, productive, and intentional, exactly as George envisioned when he first studied European land management decades earlier. What visitors experience today is not simply wealth on display, it is continuity. A lineage of decisions stretching across more than a century, each one resisting the easier path of liquidation. Every ticket sold, every glass of wine poured, every wedding hosted on the grounds exists for a single reason: to keep the house standing. That reality reframes how Biltmore should be understood. It is not a monument to excess alone. It is a case study in survival. The estate has lived through world wars, economic collapse, cultural backlash against aristocracy, shifting tax laws, and changing public attitudes toward wealth. At multiple points, its destruction would have seemed inevitable, and yet it remains. In that sense, Edith Vanderbilt's decision in 1930 may be the most consequential moment in the estate's history. Opening the house to the public permanently altered its meaning. Biltmore stopped being a private dream and became a shared one. The public, once excluded, became stakeholders in its survival. Their curiosity, their admission fees, and their fascination transformed the house from a liability into an asset. Today, Biltmore occupies a unique space in American culture. It is both deeply personal and undeniably public. A family still lives on the estate, yet millions walk through its rooms. It functions as a business, yet carries emotional weight far beyond profit margins. It represents wealth, but also preservation, education, and long-term thinking in a country often defined by short-term gain. George Vanderbilt could not have predicted this outcome. He did not build Biltmore as a tourist destination. He built it as a retreat from modernity, a place where beauty, knowledge, and land could coexist. But his underlying belief that some things are worth sustaining, even when they are impractical, proved adaptable. That belief is what ultimately saved Biltmore. As long as future generations continue to understand that balance, adaptation without erasure, commerce without exploitation, preservation without stagnation, the house will endure, standing where it has always stood, against logic and precedent, in the mountains of North Carolina, not just as America's largest private home, but as proof that vision, when paired with stewardship, can outlast the age that created it. And that endurance places Biltmore in a category of its own. In American history, wealth has often been loud, temporary, and self-consuming. Fortunes rise quickly, display themselves aggressively, and vanish just as fast. Mansions are built as declarations of dominance, only to be demolished when dominance fades. Biltmore breaks that pattern, not because it was larger, but because it was treated differently. From the beginning, George Vanderbilt did not see his estate as disposable. He did not build for applause or rivalry. He built for permanence. That mindset shaped every decision that followed, even after his death. Edith did not preserve Biltmore out of nostalgia alone. She preserved it because she understood its deeper purpose. It was proof that America could produce something refined, enduring, and culturally serious without copying Europe blindly or abandoning practicality altogether. That philosophy continues to guide the estate today. Preservation at Biltmore is not passive. It is active, ongoing, and costly. Roofs are replaced stone by stone, woodwork is conserved by hand. Fabrics are rotated and protected from light. Art is monitored constantly for humidity and temperature. Nothing is left to chance. The house demands attention the way a living organism does, and neglect would be fatal. This level of care explains why Biltmore feels different from other historic sites. Visitors do not sense abandonment or decline. They sense continuity. The house does not feel like a relic. It feels occupied, maintained, and respected. Even the wear in certain spaces tells a story of use rather than decay. There is also something uniquely American about Biltmore's survival. In Europe, great estates endured because aristocracy endured. Titles, land rights, and social hierarchies protected them. In the United States, none of that existed. Biltmore survived in a country that actively dismantled inherited wealth through taxation and cultural pressure. It survived because its owners repeatedly chose responsibility over liquidation. That choice is rare. It requires accepting that preservation is never finished. Each generation inherits not a completed achievement, but an obligation. To own Biltmore is not to possess it freely, but to serve it. To plan not just for the next decade, but for the next century. Few families are willing to shoulder that burden. Fewer still succeed. This is why Biltmore now represents more than George Vanderbilt's dream. It represents the cumulative discipline of everyone who refused to let the dream collapse when it became inconvenient. Edith opening the doors. William Cecil expanding revenue streams. Later generations modernizing operations without compromising identity. Each step was controversial in its time. Each was necessary. Standing on the estate today, it becomes clear that Biltmore's true scale is not measured in square footage or acres. It is measured in time. In decades survived, in crises absorbed, in transformations endured, without surrendering essence. That is why Biltmore still matters. Not as a symbol of how much wealth once existed, but as evidence of what happens when wealth is paired with foresight, when creation is followed by stewardship, when beauty is treated not as decoration, but as responsibility. Most Gilded Age mansions tell a cautionary tale about excess. Biltmore tells a different story. It tells the story of restraint after excess, of adaptation after collapse, of preservation in a culture that rarely rewards patience. And that is why, more than a century after its completion, Biltmore still stands where logic says it should not, quietly proving that some visions, when protected fiercely enough, can survive long after the world that created them has disappeared. There is also a deeper reason Biltmore endures, one that goes beyond economics or preservation strategy. From its earliest days, the estate was never just about display, it was about systems. George Vanderbilt did not simply build a house and decorate it. He designed an ecosystem. Land, labor, architecture, technology, culture, and education were meant to work together. That systems-based thinking was rare in the Gilded Age, where most fortunes were spent on symbols rather than structures. George believed land should be improved, not exploited. His forestry program, guided by scientific principles, rejected the extractive practices that had devastated much of Appalachia. Trees were harvested selectively, replanting was mandatory, watersheds were protected. Long before conservation became a national movement, Biltmore was quietly proving it could work. That philosophy later influenced national policy, including the creation of the U.S. Forest Service itself. The land surrounding the house was not scenery, it was part of the vision. This integration between house and landscape gave Biltmore a resilience other estates lacked. When times grew difficult, the estate was not entirely ornamental. It produced food. It managed forests. It adapted its land use. Even when large portions were sold to the federal government, the logic remained the same: preservation over profit, continuity over spectacle. That same mindset governs Biltmore's relationship with the public today. Visitors are not rushed through as passive observers, they are invited into a narrative. The house is interpreted, not merely displayed. Guides explain not only what exists, but why it exists, how it functioned, how it nearly failed, how it survived. In doing so, Biltmore avoids becoming a shrine to wealth. Instead, it becomes a lesson in responsibility. The scale of that lesson is often missed. It is easy to be distracted by the tapestries, the chandeliers, the sheer size of the rooms. But the true achievement is invisible. It is the uninterrupted line of stewardship stretching from the 1,890 seconds to the present day. That continuity required sacrifice. It required humility. It required decisions that contradicted social expectations at every stage. Edith Vanderbilt understood this better than anyone. She recognized that preserving Biltmore meant letting go of certain illusions. Privacy had to be surrendered. Exclusivity had to be abandoned. The house could no longer exist purely for the family. It had to justify itself. That choice redefined what legacy meant in America. Not inheritance as entitlement, but inheritance as obligation. This is why Biltmore feels different when you stand inside it. The rooms do not feel frozen. They feel watched over, maintained with intention rather than nostalgia. The house does not ask to be admired alone. It asks to be understood. And that understanding changes how the Gilded Age itself is remembered. Biltmore reframes the era not as a simple story of excess and collapse, but as a moment when alternative paths were possible. When wealth could have been stewarded rather than squandered, when permanence could have replaced spectacle. Most families chose otherwise. Biltmore remains as evidence of the road not taken. As long as that lesson remains central to its care, the estate will continue to justify its survival. Not as the largest house in America, but as one of the most deliberately preserved ideas the country has ever produced. As the decades pass, Biltmore's meaning continues to shift, shaped by the people who encounter it. For some, it is a marvel of architecture. For others, a glimpse into a vanished world of privilege. But for those who look closer, it becomes something more complex. It is a record of choices made under pressure, a structure that carries the fingerprints of every era it has survived. By the late 20th century, preservation itself had become a professional discipline. Biltmore was no longer maintained by tradition alone, but by science. Conservators studied the chemistry of paint and fabric. Engineers analyzed the stress placed on century-old beams. Historians documented not only what had survived, but what had been lost. Each restoration decision became a negotiation between authenticity and longevity. This scientific approach to preservation mirrors George Vanderbilt's original mindset. He trusted expertise, he sought knowledge, he believed that beauty required understanding to endure. In that sense, the modern estate is not a departure from his vision, but its continuation in a different language. The role of the public has also evolved. Early visitors arrived out of curiosity, drawn by the shock of scale during hard times. Later generations came seeking nostalgia, a romanticized version of the past. Today, many arrive searching for context. They want to understand how such a place was built, who maintained it, and what it cost. Biltmore increasingly tells those stories, including the labor that sustained it and the inequalities that defined the era. This broader interpretation strengthens the estate rather than weakening it. By acknowledging complexity, Biltmore avoids becoming a fantasy. It becomes a historical document in 3 dimensions. One that does not deny excess, but situates it within consequence. One that does not glorify hierarchy, but explains how it functioned and why it collapsed. That honesty is part of why Biltmore remains relevant. In a modern world grappling with questions of wealth, sustainability, and legacy, the estate offers a rare, long-term perspective. It shows what happens when resources are concentrated. It also shows what happens when those resources are managed with restraint rather than impulse. The house stands as a reminder that creation is only the first step. What matters more is what follows: maintenance, adaptation, accountability. Without those, even the grandest vision becomes temporary. Biltmore's continued existence challenges a common assumption in American culture, that success is measured by growth alone. The estate does not grow endlessly. Its land was reduced. Its private life was compromised. Its function transformed. Yet in that contraction, it found survival. That lesson is subtle, but powerful. Preservation often requires letting go of scale, of exclusivity, of original intent. What remains must be protected more fiercely than what is lost. As new generations take responsibility for Biltmore, they inherit not just buildings and land, but a precedent. A standard of care established by George's vision, Edith's resolve, and decades of quiet, disciplined management. The estate's future will depend on whether that standard continues to be honored. If it is, Biltmore will remain what it has always been at its core. Not simply a house, but an ongoing experiment in whether something created for beauty can survive in a world that constantly tests its usefulness. And that experiment is far from over. Every passing decade introduces pressures George Vanderbilt could never have imagined. Climate change threatens historic materials never designed for rising humidity and temperature extremes. Tourism patterns shift with global events, economic uncertainty, and changing travel habits. Cultural attitudes toward wealth continue to evolve, often viewing grand estates with skepticism rather than admiration. Biltmore exists within all of these forces at once. The challenge today is not simply preservation, but relevance. A house can be perfectly maintained and still lose meaning. The estate's survival depends on convincing each new generation that it matters, not as a symbol of privilege, but as a case study in responsibility, long-term thinking, and cultural continuity. This is why education has become central to Biltmore's mission. The estate increasingly frames itself as a place of learning. Visitors are encouraged to understand how the house functioned, how the land was managed, and how decisions made over a century ago still shape the present. The story is no longer just about what was built, but about what was sustained. That shift reflects a broader change in how history is consumed. Modern audiences are less impressed by scale alone. They want context. They want to know who paid the cost, who benefited, and who labored unseen. Biltmore's willingness to tell those fuller stories ensures it does not become irrelevant or misunderstood. There is also a quiet irony in the estate's current role. What began as a private retreat from modernity now depends on modern systems to survive. Digital ticketing, global marketing, logistics planning, data analysis, and complex financial modeling all support a house designed to escape such concerns. Yet this contradiction does not diminish Biltmore. It proves the estate's adaptability. The core vision remains unchanged. Beauty matters, craftsmanship matters, land matters, stewardship matters. The methods have evolved, but the values persist. This continuity is rare in American history. Most physical expressions of wealth disappear within a generation or two. They are dismantled, repurposed, or forgotten. Biltmore resists that pattern because it was never treated as disposable, even when it became inconvenient. Standing inside the house today, it is impossible not to feel the weight of time. The walls have witnessed an entire nation's transformation, from horse-drawn carriages to electric cars, from gaslight to digital screens, from industrial expansion to environmental reckoning. Through it all, Biltmore has remained not untouched, but attentive. That attentiveness is the real legacy George Vanderbilt left behind. Not the limestone walls or the soaring ceilings, but the idea that creation carries responsibility beyond one lifetime. That if something is worth building, it must also be worth maintaining, even when doing so becomes difficult, unpopular, or expensive. Biltmore's story ultimately asks a quiet but profound question. What do we choose to carry forward, and at what cost? For more than a century, the answer in the mountains of North Carolina has been clear. Some things are worth the effort, some visions deserve protection. And when care replaces conquest, even the most unlikely dreams can endure. That question, what is worth carrying forward, becomes more pressing with time. As fewer people have personal connections to the Gilded Age, Biltmore's meaning relies less on memory and more on interpretation. It must explain itself anew to audiences who live in a world defined by speed, efficiency, and constant replacement. In that context, Biltmore stands almost in defiance of modern logic. Nothing about it is efficient. Maintenance is slow. Repairs are meticulous. Decisions are made cautiously, often over years rather than months. Where modern development favors demolition and rebuilding, Biltmore insists on conservation. Stone is repaired rather than replaced. Wood is stabilized rather than removed. Original intent is studied, not overridden. This resistance to disposability gives the estate its emotional gravity. Visitors sense that care has been continuous, not performative. They are not walking through a reconstruction or a replica. They are walking through an uninterrupted chain of attention stretching back to the 19th century. That continuity is rare enough to feel almost unsettling. There is also a subtle humility embedded in Biltmore's survival. For all its grandeur, the estate does not claim perfection. It openly acknowledges that its existence required immense resources and labor. It acknowledges that it survived while others did not. That honesty allows the house to be seen not as a celebration of inequality, but as an artifact through which inequality can be examined. This is why Biltmore continues to attract scholars, preservationists, architects, and environmental planners. It offers a living archive, not just of objects, but of decisions. How land use affects longevity, how financial planning intersects with cultural value, how leadership shapes outcomes across generations. In many ways, Biltmore's most important rooms today are not its grand halls, but its offices. The spaces where budgets are debated, where long-term plans are drafted, where preservation priorities are set. The drama of Biltmore's survival no longer plays out in ballrooms, but in spreadsheets and strategic meetings. Yet the result of those quiet decisions is visible everywhere. In the way the gardens still unfold, season after season. In the way the house retains warmth rather than emptiness. In the way visitors leave with a sense that they have not just seen something impressive, but something intentional. As the 21st century progresses, Biltmore's challenge will be endurance without stagnation. To remain open without becoming diluted. To remain profitable without becoming exploitative. To remain historic without becoming frozen. These tensions will never fully disappear. They are the price of survival. What gives reason for confidence is precedent. Every previous crisis demanded reinvention. Every reinvention was met with skepticism, and yet each adaptation strengthened the estate rather than weakening it. The house that once shocked America by existing now shocks it by continuing. Biltmore's story does not end with a conclusion. It ends with a responsibility passed forward, one that cannot be inherited casually, one that must be chosen repeatedly. And as long as that choice continues to be made, the chateau in the North Carolina mountains will remain more than a relic of wealth. It will remain evidence that endurance, not excess, is the most difficult luxury of all. That endurance reframes how Biltmore should be remembered in the broader story of America. It is tempting to treat it as an outlier, a beautiful anomaly that somehow escaped the fate of its peers. But Biltmore is not an exception. It is a demonstration. A demonstration of what happens when wealth is paired with restraint, when vision is followed by accountability, and when legacy is understood as obligation rather than entitlement. George Vanderbilt did not live long enough to see the full consequences of what he created. He did not witness the collapse of the world that shaped him, the wars, the depressions, the cultural shifts that made his estate seem increasingly out of step with modern life. But in building Biltmore the way he did, deliberately, thoughtfully, and with an eye toward permanence, he left behind something stronger than fortune. He left behind a framework. That framework allowed others to step in when he could not. Edith Vanderbilt understood that survival required sacrifice. William Cecil understood that preservation required innovation. Each generation after them learned the same lesson in different forms. There is no final solution. There is only continued effort. This is why Biltmore remains compelling even to those who feel no nostalgia for the Gilded Age. It is not a fantasy of the past. It is a mirror held up to the present. It asks whether modern society is capable of thinking beyond quarterly returns and immediate gratification, whether we can commit to maintaining what we inherit instead of replacing it. In a nation built on expansion and reinvention, Biltmore stands as a rare counterpoint. It suggests that progress does not always mean building something new. Sometimes it means protecting what already exists, even when doing so is inconvenient, expensive, or misunderstood. That message resonates more deeply now than ever. As historic structures disappear and landscapes are reshaped beyond recognition, Biltmore offers proof that continuity is possible. Not effortless, not perfect, but achievable through discipline and foresight. When visitors leave the estate, what lingers is not just the image of towering ceilings or ornate stonework. It is the realization that none of it would still be there without intention, without people, generation after generation, choosing preservation over profit. Biltmore's true monument is not its size, it is its survival. And as long as that survival continues to be chosen deliberately, the house George Vanderbilt built will remain what it has quietly become over more than a century, a testament to the power of stewardship, a reminder that some visions are not meant to be consumed, but carried forward. That idea, carrying something forward rather than consuming it, is perhaps Biltmore's most lasting contribution to American culture. It stands in contrast to the pattern that defined so much of the Gilded Age, a pattern of rapid accumulation followed by rapid disappearance. Railroads collapsed, banks failed, fortunes evaporated, and the houses built to symbolize those fortunes vanished almost as quickly. Biltmore endured because it was never treated as disposable, even when it became burdensome. This endurance forces a reconsideration of how legacy works. In most cases, legacy is passive. Wealth is inherited, property is sold, responsibility dissolves with time. At Biltmore, legacy has been active. Each generation has been required to participate, to intervene, to decide again whether the estate should continue. Survival has never been automatic. It has been chosen repeatedly. That choice carries weight. It means accepting limits. The family that owns Biltmore does not extract maximum profit from it. They reinvest constantly. Revenue generated by tourism, hospitality, and wine production flows back into preservation. Roofs are repaired, stone is stabilized, paintings are conserved, gardens are replanted. The estate consumes as much as it earns, not unlike it did in George Vanderbilt's lifetime, but now with a different purpose. In this way, Biltmore has become an unusual kind of institution. It is privately owned, yet functionally public. It is commercial, yet preservation-driven. It is historic, yet operational. These contradictions would destroy a less carefully managed place. At Biltmore, they coexist because no single priority is allowed to dominate completely. This balance is fragile. A downturn in tourism can threaten budgets. Extreme weather can damage structures never designed for modern climate conditions. Shifts in cultural values can affect public interest. Every decade introduces new vulnerabilities. There is no moment when Biltmore is truly safe. And yet, vulnerability is part of what keeps it alive. It prevents complacency. It forces long-term thinking. It demands that decisions be made not for immediate gain, but for endurance. This is why Biltmore's story continues to matter beyond its walls. It offers a counter-narrative in a culture that often equates success with scale and speed. It suggests that sustainability, whether cultural, environmental, or financial, depends on restraint as much as ambition. George Vanderbilt's original dream was never about dominance. It was about cultivation. Cultivation of land, of knowledge, of beauty. That distinction explains why his estate survived when others did not. It was designed to grow slowly, to improve over time, rather than to overwhelm. Standing in the shadow of Biltmore today, it becomes clear that the house itself is only part of the story. The real achievement is the discipline required to keep it standing. The patience to repair, rather than replace. The humility to open private space to the public. The foresight to adapt without erasing the past. In the end, Biltmore is not just a relic of what America once was. It is a test of what America chooses to preserve. As long as that test continues to be taken seriously, the chateau in the North Carolina mountains will remain, not as a monument to excess, but as proof that stewardship can outlast spectacle. That stewardship places Biltmore in a rare position. It is both finished and unfinished. Finished in its architecture, its design, its original intent. Unfinished in its responsibility, its upkeep, its future. The house will never be complete in the way George Vanderbilt might have imagined, because time itself keeps adding new demands. Every generation that inherits Biltmore inherits a different problem set. Earlier generations faced collapse through overstaffing and unsustainable operating costs. Later ones faced taxation, public perception, and economic downturns. Today's challenges are quieter, but no less serious. Aging infrastructure hidden behind historic walls, rising insurance costs, environmental pressures that threaten gardens, forests, and stonework alike. The work never stops. What makes Biltmore unusual is that this ongoing effort is not hidden. It is part of the story now. Visitors are increasingly aware that preservation is labor, not nostalgia. That what they see exists because someone chose repair over replacement, conservation over convenience. In this way, the estate educates not just about history, but about responsibility. There is also a moral dimension to Biltmore's endurance. Wealth created the house, but wealth alone did not save it. Many families had equal or greater fortunes and lost everything they built. What preserved Biltmore was a refusal to disengage, a willingness to adapt publicly, to compromise privately, and to endure criticism in exchange for survival. Edith Vanderbilt understood this instinctively. So did the generations that followed her. They accepted that legacy is not glamorous. It is administrative. It is repetitive. It requires making unpopular decisions that only reveal their value decades later. That mindset is rare, especially in cultures that reward immediacy. Biltmore therefore functions as a quiet rebuke to the idea that history preserves itself. It does not. History collapses unless someone intervenes. Buildings rot. Landscapes degrade. Meaning erodes. Preservation is an act, not a passive state. Standing on the grounds today, it becomes clear that Biltmore's true scale cannot be measured in rooms or acres. It is measured in time successfully bridged, in choices deferred for the sake of continuity, in profits reinvested rather than extracted, in restraint exercised where excess would have been easier. This is why Biltmore still feels alive, not because it escaped change, but because it absorbed it. The estate has been reshaped by every era it survived, yet never surrendered its core purpose. It still exists to demonstrate what intentional creation looks like when paired with long-term care. As long as that pairing continues, Biltmore will remain more than a historic site. It will remain a living argument. An argument that permanence is possible, that beauty can be maintained, that inheritance can be handled responsibly, and in a nation where most monuments fade or fracture under the weight of time, that argument may be Biltmore's most enduring achievement. That argument grows stronger the longer Biltmore stands. Time itself has become part of the evidence. Every decade that passes without collapse reinforces the idea that endurance is not accidental. It is engineered through patience, planning, and restraint. Biltmore's continued existence challenges the assumption that private ownership and public value must be in conflict. In many cases, historic properties survive only after being surrendered to institutions, governments, or trusts. Biltmore followed a different path. It remained in family hands, not because that was easier, but because it demanded personal accountability. Decisions could not be deferred to committees or diluted by bureaucracy. Someone had to say yes or no. Someone had to absorb the consequences. This concentration of responsibility has shaped the estate's character. Changes at Biltmore tend to be incremental rather than dramatic. There are no sudden reinventions, no sweeping overhauls. Adaptation happens quietly, often invisibly. That slow pace frustrates those who expect rapid modernization, but it is precisely what protects the house from becoming unrecognizable. The estate's relationship with time is fundamentally different from that of most modern enterprises. Success is not measured year to year, but generation to generation. A profitable season matters, but only insofar as it contributes to long-term stability. Short-term gains that threaten long-term integrity are avoided. This mindset is increasingly rare, and that rarity gives Biltmore its gravity. It also explains why the house feels insulated from trends. Interior spaces are not updated to reflect contemporary tastes. Gardens are not redesigned to chase novelty. Programming evolves, but the core experience remains rooted in continuity. Visitors sense that they are stepping into a place governed by principles rather than fashion. That consistency creates trust. People return because they know what will not change. The house will still feel authentic. The landscape will still feel intentional. The story will still be told with care. In a culture saturated with replication and replacement, that reliability becomes valuable. Biltmore's endurance also reframes how power is understood. During the Gilded Age, power was demonstrated through expansion. Bigger houses, larger estates, greater displays of wealth. Biltmore reverses that equation. Its power now lies in its refusal to expand endlessly, in its willingness to contract, consolidate, and preserve. Strength is measured not by growth, but by survival. This shift mirrors broader changes in how legacy is defined. Today, legacy is increasingly tied to sustainability, responsibility, and stewardship. Biltmore, unintentionally, anticipated that evolution. What began as a personal dream has become a model for how inherited resources can be managed without erasing their origins. That transformation did not require abandoning George Vanderbilt's vision. It required interpreting it differently. Beauty was never meant to be static. It was meant to be cared for. Land was never meant to be consumed. It was meant to be restored. Knowledge was never meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared. In this light, Biltmore's openness to the public is not a compromise. It is a fulfillment. The house no longer belongs only to those who own it. It belongs, in part, to those who learn from it. Who walk its halls, who leave with a deeper understanding of what endurance demands. And as long as that understanding continues to be passed on, Biltmore will remain what it has quietly become over more than a century. Not just America's largest private home, but one of its longest-running lessons in stewardship, patience, and the cost of choosing preservation over forgetting. That lesson becomes clearer the longer one spends with Biltmore's story. The estate is not preserved because it is flawless. It is preserved because it is instructive. It reveals how ambition can coexist with restraint, how wealth can be paired with responsibility, and how beauty can survive only when someone is willing to protect it long after its creator is gone. In many ways, Biltmore exposes a paradox at the heart of American history. The nation celebrates innovation, disruption, and constant reinvention, yet quietly mourns the loss of what those forces erase. Biltmore sits in that tension. It exists because, at critical moments, someone chose continuity over novelty. Someone chose to repair rather than replace. Someone accepted that preservation is slower, harder, and less glamorous than building something new. Those choices were never universally praised. Opening the house to the public was ridiculed. Selling land was criticized. Turning portions of the estate into commercial ventures was seen by some as dilution. Yet history has validated those decisions. Without them, Biltmore would almost certainly have vanished, another name on a list of lost American palaces. What remains today is not a frozen artifact, but a carefully managed balance. The estate walks a narrow line between access and protection. Too much openness would damage the house. Too much restriction would make it irrelevant. Every policy reflects that tension. Every visitor is part of that equation, whether they realize it or not. This dynamic gives Biltmore a rare ethical dimension. To visit is not simply to consume an experience, it is to participate, indirectly, in preservation. Admission fees fund conservation. Interest sustains relevance. Attention justifies effort. The house survives not in spite of its audience, but because of it. That reality transforms the visitor's role. People are no longer passive observers of history. They become contributors to its continuation. The past is not sealed behind glass. It is supported through engagement. That model, private stewardship sustained by public participation, is one of Biltmore's most significant innovations, even if it emerged out of necessity rather than design. As years turn into decades, the estate's greatest challenge will remain the same: to remember why it exists, not to glorify excess, but to honor intention, not to celebrate wealth, but to demonstrate care, not to cling to the past, but to carry it forward intelligently. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore believing beauty was worth the effort. Edith Vanderbilt proved survival was worth the sacrifice. Later generations proved adaptation was worth the criticism. Together, they created something far more enduring than stone and mortar. They created a standard. That standard now rests with those who inherit the responsibility, whether by blood, by profession, or simply by walking through the gates. As long as that responsibility is taken seriously, Biltmore will continue to do what it has done for more than a century. Stand quietly, endure patiently, and remind anyone who enters that some creations are not meant to disappear just because time insists they should. That reminder is subtle, but persistent. It lingers long after visitors leave the estate, long after the towers disappear behind the trees. Biltmore stays with people not because it is large, but because it contradicts expectations. It is evidence that something built at the height of excess did not have to end in ruin. Most Gilded Age stories conclude with collapse. Fortunes dissolve. Houses are demolished. Families scatter. Biltmore refuses that ending. Instead, it offers a different arc, one defined by intervention rather than inevitability. At every critical moment, someone stepped in and chose effort over abandonment. That pattern matters because it challenges the idea that decline is unavoidable. Biltmore shows that survival is not passive. It is active, deliberate, and often uncomfortable. The estate survived not because conditions were favorable, but because people responded intelligently when conditions were not. This is why Biltmore resonates beyond architecture or history. It becomes a metaphor for institutions, for families, for cultural memory itself. It asks whether longevity is possible in systems designed for speed and replacement. It suggests that it is, but only at a cost. That cost is vigilance, the constant awareness that what exists today can disappear tomorrow without care. At Biltmore, this awareness is built into daily operations. Every repair is documented, every restoration is debated, every expansion is weighed against impact. The estate moves slowly because speed has consequences it cannot afford. There is something almost radical about that slowness. In a culture driven by immediacy, Biltmore insists on patience. It resists shortcuts. It prioritizes outcomes measured in decades, not headlines. That resistance is not accidental. It is inherited. George Vanderbilt did not rush to build Biltmore. He spent years studying, traveling, observing. Edith Vanderbilt did not rush to save it. She spent decades adjusting, compromising, and enduring criticism. Later generations did not rush to monetize it recklessly. They diversified carefully, understanding that once authenticity is lost, it cannot be regained. This long view is what ultimately defines Biltmore. The house is not impressive because it is old. It is impressive because it has been continuously chosen, again and again, against easier alternatives. That choice is never final. Each generation must renew it. Each era introduces new pressures that make abandonment tempting, and yet, so far, the answer has remained the same. Preserve, adapt, continue. As long as that answer holds, Biltmore will remain more than a surviving mansion. It will remain a living demonstration that endurance is not a matter of luck, but of resolve. That resolve gives Biltmore a rare kind of authority. It does not demand admiration. It earns attention quietly, through persistence. In a country where history is often simplified into triumph or failure, Biltmore occupies the uncomfortable middle ground. It is neither a fairy tale nor a cautionary ruin. It is a record of sustained effort. The estate reminds us that survival is rarely dramatic. There is no single moment when Biltmore was saved forever. There were only long sequences of decisions made without certainty. Budgets tightened, plans revised, expectations lowered, pride set aside. Again and again, continuity was chosen over convenience. This is why Biltmore's story feels unusually modern. Its challenges mirror those faced by institutions today. Aging infrastructure, rising costs, public scrutiny, shifting cultural values, environmental pressure. The house stands as proof that long-term thinking is not outdated, even if it is unfashionable. Biltmore also reveals how fragile permanence truly is. Remove a decade of care and the illusion collapses. Stone cracks, wood warps, systems fail, beauty fades quickly without attention. The estate's scale amplifies this reality. There is no margin for neglect. Preservation at Biltmore is unforgiving. Miss one generation, and recovery may be impossible. That fragility is what gives the house its quiet urgency. It is not immortal. It survives only because someone wakes up every day committed to its care. That commitment is invisible to most visitors, but it underlies everything they see. In that sense, Biltmore functions as a living warning, not about excess, but about neglect. It shows what happens when care is sustained, and by implication, what happens when it is not. Most American mansions vanished not because they were hated, but because they were no longer worth the effort. Biltmore remained worth the effort because its stewards believed beauty had value beyond immediate return. That belief has carried it through eras that dismissed such ideas as impractical. Time has proven otherwise. As the estate moves further into the future, its greatest challenge may be relevance without dilution, to remain meaningful without becoming spectacle, to invite engagement without sacrificing integrity, to survive without surrendering its identity. These tensions will never disappear. They are the price of endurance. But if Biltmore's past offers any guidance, it is that careful adaptation can coexist with fidelity to purpose. The chateau in the North Carolina mountains was never meant to be eternal, and yet, through discipline rather than luck, it has approached something close. Not permanence, but continuity. And in a world defined by impermanence, that may be the most extraordinary achievement of all. That continuity gives Biltmore a quiet power that grows with time. It no longer needs to announce itself. Its presence alone is enough. Standing intact where so many others vanished, it forces comparison without saying a word. It invites the question every lost mansion can no longer answer. Why did this one survive? The answer is not sentiment. It is discipline. It is the refusal to treat legacy as decoration. From the moment Edith Vanderbilt opened the doors to the public, Biltmore crossed a line that most elite families refused to cross. Privacy was sacrificed so permanence could be preserved. Prestige was traded for longevity. That exchange reshaped the estate's destiny. Over time, this decision altered public perception as well. Biltmore stopped being viewed solely as a symbol of wealth and began to be understood as a shared cultural artifact. Generations who never lived in the Gilded Age came to see it not as a provocation, but as a point of reference. A way to understand scale, craftsmanship, and the mindset of an era that reshaped America. That shift matters. When history becomes inaccessible, it becomes abstract. When it can be walked through, touched, and experienced, it gains weight. Biltmore gives physical form to ideas that are otherwise difficult to grasp. Industrial power, inherited wealth, social hierarchy, labor, ambition, responsibility. All of it is embedded in stone, wood, and landscape. This is why Biltmore continues to be studied, not just visited. Architects analyze its proportions. Conservationists examine its materials. Land managers look to its forestry practices as early models of sustainability. Historians trace how one estate navigated economic forces that destroyed its peers. Few places offer such a complete record in a single setting. And yet, for all its importance, Biltmore has avoided becoming untouchable. It has resisted the temptation to seal itself off behind reverence. People still gather there. They celebrate. They marry. They walk the gardens. They drink wine grown on land George once restored. Life continues around the house, not just within it. That may be the most important lesson of all. Preservation does not require isolation. In fact, isolation often leads to irrelevance. Biltmore survives because it remains integrated into living culture. It adapts without erasing. It welcomes without surrendering. George Vanderbilt could not have predicted this outcome. He built a private refuge. What emerged instead was a model for how heritage can function in a modern world. Not as a burden locked in the past, but as a responsibility shared across time. As long as that responsibility is understood, the estate will endure, not untouched, not unchanged, but intact in the ways that matter most. Stone held together by care, land shaped by intention, beauty defended by effort. That is what still stands in the mountains of North Carolina. And that is why Biltmore is not merely remembered. It is still alive. That sense of life is what ultimately separates Biltmore from memory alone. Memory fades, buildings crumble, but living systems, when tended, persist. Biltmore is not preserved as a frozen monument. It breathes through daily use, through maintenance crews moving quietly before dawn, through gardeners replanting beds that will bloom again next season, through archivists cataloging objects that will outlast their own careers. This living quality reshapes how history functions here. The past is not sealed off, it intersects constantly with the present. Modern staff members work within walls built for gaslight. Digital systems protect rooms designed for candles. Contemporary visitors move through spaces shaped by 19th century assumptions about class, labor, and permanence. Time layers itself rather than replacing what came before. That layering is fragile. One careless decision could fracture it. Over-commercialization could cheapen the experience. Neglect could accelerate decay. Excessive restriction could render the estate irrelevant. The balance must be maintained constantly, and that balance depends on judgment rather than formula. This is why Biltmore cannot be easily replicated. Other estates can restore rooms or reopen houses, but few can recreate uninterrupted stewardship. Once continuity is broken, it cannot be repaired. Biltmore's greatest asset is not its architecture, but the fact that it never stopped being cared for. Even its imperfections tell that story. Slight variations in restoration techniques reflect evolving standards. Adjustments to land use reveal changing environmental awareness. Shifts in interpretation reflect new historical understanding. The estate does not pretend to exist outside time. It acknowledges time and works within it. That honesty gives Biltmore credibility. It does not claim moral purity or timeless relevance. It offers something more valuable, a record of sustained effort in an imperfect world. A demonstration that preservation is not about freezing history, but about negotiating with it continuously. This is why the house still commands attention long after the shock of its size fades. Visitors eventually stop counting rooms and begin noticing intention. They sense that nothing here exists by accident. Everything remains because someone decided it should. In that sense, Biltmore is less a mansion than a commitment renewed quietly each day, not through spectacle, but through work, and that work continues. As long as there are people willing to choose care over convenience, patience over profit, and responsibility over retreat, the chateau in the North Carolina mountains will remain standing, not as an echo of excess, but as proof that endurance, when chosen deliberately, can outlast even the most turbulent century. That endurance invites a final reflection on what Biltmore truly represents. Beyond the stone walls and towering roofs, beyond the numbers that once shocked the nation, the estate embodies a philosophy that remains rare. It suggests that creation carries an obligation that does not end with completion. That the act of building something meaningful is only the beginning of a much longer responsibility. George Vanderbilt could afford to build Biltmore. What he could not guarantee was its future. That future depended entirely on whether others would care enough to sustain it. Edith Vanderbilt proved that care could outweigh convention. Later generations proved that adaptation did not require surrender. Each era added its own layer of meaning, shaped not by ambition alone, but by restraint. In that way, Biltmore becomes a quiet critique of the Gilded Age itself. It exposes the difference between wealth used to dominate and wealth used to cultivate, between display and stewardship, between excess that consumes itself and vision that demands continuity. Most of the era's great houses chose the former path. Biltmore, almost by accident, chose the latter. Standing on the grounds today, it is impossible not to feel that contrast. The house does not shout, it does not compete, it simply remains. Its survival is not dramatic, but deliberate. A result of countless unseen decisions made in offices rather than ballrooms, in budgets rather than banquets. That is why Biltmore still matters. Not because it is the largest private home ever built, but because it demonstrates what happens when scale is matched by responsibility, when beauty is paired with discipline, when legacy is treated as work rather than inheritance. The estate's continued existence does not guarantee its future. Nothing does. But its past offers a blueprint, one that shows survival is not a matter of nostalgia or luck, but of commitment renewed again and again. As long as that commitment holds, the chateau in the North Carolina mountains will continue to stand, not as a relic trapped in time, but as a living testament to the idea that some creations are worth carrying forward, no matter how demanding that task becomes. And in a world that often measures success by how quickly something is replaced, Biltmore offers a quieter measure: how long it is cared for, how carefully it is preserved, and how many generations choose to keep saying yes. That choice, the act of continuing to say yes, is what transforms Biltmore from an architectural achievement into a cultural one. Architecture alone does not endure. Stone cracks, wood rots. Systems fail. What endures is intention carried forward by people who accept responsibility for something they did not create themselves. Biltmore exists today because generation after generation accepted that burden. This is a difficult idea in American culture. The nation was built on movement, on leaving things behind, on starting fresh. Biltmore represents the opposite instinct: stay, repair, maintain. Improve slowly. These are not glamorous values. They do not generate headlines. They require patience in a society that rewards speed. Yet without them, nothing survives. The house itself reflects this philosophy. Its walls are not pristine. They show age, subtle wear, the evidence of time passing under care rather than neglect. The floors have been walked for more than a century. The wood has darkened. The stone has weathered. These are not flaws. They are proof of continuity. A house without wear is a house without life. Biltmore's survival also reframes how power is remembered. During the Gilded Age, power was measured by accumulation: how much land, how many rooms, how many servants. Today, Biltmore's power lies in its restraint, in what it refused to destroy, in what it chose not to sell, in what it preserved when doing so made no financial sense in the short term. That restraint required a fundamental shift in values. Edith Vanderbilt understood that the age of private palaces was over. She did not try to preserve the lifestyle that Biltmore had been built for. She preserved the structure, the land, and the idea behind it. Everything else was negotiable. That distinction saved the estate. Later generations expanded that thinking. They accepted that survival meant redefining what ownership looked like. A private home became a public destination. A family legacy became a shared experience. Commerce became a tool rather than a betrayal. These changes were not signs of failure. They were signs of intelligence. Biltmore today is sustained by systems George Vanderbilt never imagined: ticketing algorithms, climate monitoring, conservation science, hospitality logistics, marketing strategies. None of these diminish the house. They protect it. They allow a 19th century vision to exist inside a 21st century reality. This coexistence is fragile. Remove any one pillar and the structure weakens. Remove tourism and revenue disappears. Remove preservation and authenticity erodes. Remove public interest and justification fades. Biltmore survives because these elements are held in balance, constantly adjusted, constantly reassessed. What makes this remarkable is that there is no finish line. No moment when the work is complete. Preservation is not a project. It is a process. One that does not end with success, but restarts with every passing year. Each generation inherits not certainty, but responsibility. This is why Biltmore's story resonates beyond its walls. It speaks to a broader question facing institutions, families, and cultures alike. What do we preserve, and why? What is worth the effort of maintenance? What deserves to be carried forward, even when doing so is inconvenient, expensive, or misunderstood? Biltmore offers an answer without preaching. It simply stands as evidence. Evidence that some things are worth sustained attention. That beauty paired with discipline can outlast volatility. That legacy, when treated as obligation rather than entitlement, can survive forces designed to erase it. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore as an act of faith. Faith that beauty mattered. Faith that land could be restored. Faith that knowledge and culture deserved a permanent home. He did not live long enough to see how fragile that faith would become. Edith Vanderbilt carried it forward when circumstances turned hostile. Later generations protected it when memory alone was no longer enough. Today, that faith rests with those who manage the estate and those who walk through it. Every visitor becomes part of the equation, not as a spectator, but as a participant in continuity. The house exists because people continue to care that it exists. And that may be Biltmore's greatest legacy. Not its size, not its wealth, but its demonstration that endurance is not accidental. It is chosen, repeatedly, quietly, often without recognition. As long as that choice continues to be made, the chateau in the North Carolina mountains will remain where it has always been. Standing against time, not through force, but through care. That care operates on a timescale most modern projects never consider. At Biltmore, plans are written not for quarters or fiscal years, but for decades. Roof replacements are scheduled with the expectation that no one currently working there will see the next one completed. Tree management plans extend beyond human lifespans. Art conservation decisions are made with the assumption that the results must last another 100 years. This long view fundamentally alters how decisions are made. Shortcuts are rejected because their consequences arrive too soon. Cheaper materials are avoided because they fail quietly and expensively later. Every intervention is judged not only by how it looks today, but by how it will age. This discipline is invisible to most visitors, but it is embedded everywhere. It is present in the way original materials are preserved whenever possible, in the way replacement stone is sourced to match not just color, but weathering behavior, in the way fabrics are rotated to minimize light damage, in the way mechanical systems are designed to be reversible, so future generations are not trapped by today's solutions. Biltmore is constantly being prepared for people who do not yet exist. That future orientation is perhaps the most unusual aspect of the estate. George Vanderbilt built for permanence in an era obsessed with dominance. Edith preserved for survival in an era defined by collapse. Later generations planned for sustainability in an era increasingly hostile to inherited scale. Each phase required a different mindset, but all were anchored in the same principle. Think beyond yourself. This principle is what separates stewardship from ownership. Ownership implies rights. Stewardship implies obligation. At Biltmore, obligation has always outweighed entitlement. No generation has been free to treat the estate as disposable property. Every generation has inherited a responsibility heavy enough to shape their lives around it. That weight is not romantic. It is administrative, financial, and emotional. It involves difficult conversations about taxes, land use, staffing, and access. It involves public criticism from those who misunderstand compromise as betrayal. It involves constant vigilance against erosion, both physical and cultural. Few families would willingly accept such a burden. Fewer would sustain it for more than a century. This is why Biltmore's survival feels improbable even now. Not because the house is large, but because the discipline required to maintain it has outlasted the social structures that created it. The Gilded Age produced many mansions. It did not produce many stewards. Biltmore also complicates how wealth itself is judged. The house was born from inequality. There is no escaping that fact, yet its continued existence has been shaped by restraint rather than exploitation. The fortune that built it could have been liquidated many times over. Instead, it was converted into maintenance, employment, preservation, and public access. Wealth that once excluded now supports something shared. This does not erase the past. It contextualizes it. Biltmore does not ask to be forgiven. It asks to be understood. Understanding requires acknowledging both the privilege that created it and the discipline that saved it. Both are true. Neither alone explains its survival. As time moves forward, that complexity becomes increasingly important. Simplified narratives do not endure. They collapse under scrutiny. Biltmore survives because its story can withstand examination. It holds contradiction without falling apart. Grandeur and practicality, excess and restraint, private vision and public responsibility. In the end, Biltmore remains because it was never allowed to become a relic. It adapted without surrendering its essence. It changed without erasing its past. It accepted that survival would always require effort, and that effort would never be finished. And so the house continues, not as a monument frozen in admiration, but as a living commitment, one that demands patience, foresight, and humility from everyone who inherits it. That is the real architecture of Biltmore. Not just stone and wood, but time, care, and the repeated decision to protect something simply because it is worth protecting.